The Ripper's Gambit. Who among 14 holds the truth? Episode 14 The Final Reveal. Hello and welcome to the final episode of The Ripper's Gambit, the podcast series that explores the mystery of Jack the Ripper, the infamous serial killer who terrorised London in 1888. I'm your host, and in this episode I will reveal my suspect of choice and explain why I think he is the real Jack the Ripper. But before I do that, let me recap what we have learned so far in this series. We have investigated 14 suspects who have been linked to the Jack the Ripper case, either by the police, the media or the public, at the time of the murders or in the years since. We have examined their backgrounds, their motives, their alibis, and their connections to the crime scenes and the victims. We have also looked at the evidence for and against each suspect and evaluated their strengths and weaknesses as potential candidates for the Ripper. We have also learned about the historical and social context of the Jack the Ripper case and how it influenced the investigation and the public perception of the murders. We have seen how the East End of London was a place of poverty, overcrowding, crime and disease, where many immigrants, especially Jews and Russians, settled to start a new life and escape persecution. We have seen how prostitution was widespread and tolerated as long as it did not cause a public disturbance, and how many women resorted to selling their bodies to survive. We have seen how the police were underfunded, understaffed, and under pressure to catch the killer, and how they faced criticism and ridicule from the press and the public. We have seen how the media sensationalized the murders and how they received letters allegedly written by the killer, who taunted the police and the public with his gruesome deeds and his elusive identity. We have seen how the name Jack the Ripper originated from one of these letters, and how it became a symbol of fear and fascination for generations to come. We have also seen how the murders had a lasting impact on the public imagination, and how they inspired countless books, films, documentaries, games, and theories about the identity and the motives of the killer. We have seen how some of these theories are based on solid research and evidence, while others are based on speculation and fabrication. We have seen how some of these theories are plausible and convincing, while others are absurd and ridiculous. We have seen how some of these theories are supported by experts and authorities, while others are rejected and dismissed. But despite all the investigations, all the evidence, all the theories, and all the debates, the question remains: who was Jack the Ripper? Well, after reviewing all the information and arguments presented in this series, I have come to a conclusion. I have made my final guess, and I'm ready to share it with you. My suspect of choice for Jack the Ripper is William Berry. Yes, William Berry, the man who was hanged in Dundee, Scotland, in 1889 for the murder of his wife, Ellen Berry. The man who was suspected by the executioner, James Berry, and by some of the police officers who arrested him, of being Jack the Ripper. The man who wrote on the door of his flat, "Jack Ripper is at the back of this door." The man who confessed to his wife's murder, but said he was afraid he would be arrested as Jack the Ripper. Why do I think William Berry is Jack the Ripper? Well, let me explain. First of all, let me remind you of the basic facts about William Berry. He was born in 1857 in Stourbridge, Worcestershire, the son of a local surgeon. He had a troubled childhood, as his father died in a horse and cart accident. His mother was admitted to a lunatic asylum, and his sister died of scarlet fever. He was raised by his uncle and attended a charity school. He worked as a warehouseman, a lock manufacturer, and a hawker before moving to London in 1887. He married Ellen Elliot, a servant and a prostitute, in 1888 and lived in Bow, near Whitechapel, where he sold sawdust. He was abusive and violent towards his wife, and was once caught threatening her with a knife. He moved to Dundee in January 1889, where he killed his wife by strangling her with a rope and stabbing her in the abdomen. He then packed her body in a trunk and wrote the message on the door. He eventually turned himself into the police and was tried, convicted, and executed for his crime. Now let me tell you why I think these facts point to him being Jack the Ripper. First of all, there is the timing and the location of his movements. William Berry was living in Bow, next to Whitechapel, during the time of the Ripper murders, which occurred between August and November 1888. He was not living in London before or after that period. He moved to London from Birmingham in early 1888, and he moved to Dundee from London in early 1889. This means that he was in the vicinity of the murders when they happened, and that he left the area when they stopped. This is consistent with the idea that he was the killer, and that he fled the scene when the police and the public were closing in on him. Second, there is the similarity and the difference between his wife's murder and the Ripper murders. William Berry killed his wife by strangling her with a rope and stabbing her in the abdomen. He also mutilated her genitals and removed some of her organs. These are very similar to the methods and the injuries inflicted by Jack the Ripper on his victims. However, there is also a difference. William Berry killed his wife indoors, in his own flat, and hid her body in a trunk. He did not kill her on the streets, in the open, and leave her body exposed. This suggests that he changed his modus operandi, and that he was more careful and cautious after the Ripper murders. This could be because he was aware of the increased police presence and public attention, and that he wanted to avoid detection and arrest. Third, there is the message and the confession that he left behind. William Berry wrote on the door of his flat, "Jack Ripper is at the back of this door." He also told the police that he was afraid he would be arrested as Jack the Ripper. These statements could be interpreted in different ways. They could be seen as a false confession, a delusion, a joke, or a diversion, but they could also be seen as a true confession, a slip, a boast, or a clue. They could be seen as evidence that he was indeed Jack the Ripper, and that he wanted to reveal his identity, either out of guilt, pride, or madness. Of course, these facts are not conclusive, and there are some problems and objections that could be raised against them. For example, one could argue that William Berry was not a surgeon or a butcher, and that he did not have the anatomical knowledge or the skill to perform the Ripper murders. One could also argue that William Berry did not match the physical descriptions or the eyewitness accounts of the Ripper, and that he did not have the psychological profile or the motive to commit the Ripper murders. One could also argue that William Berry was not the only suspect who had a connection to the Ripper murders, and that there were other suspects who had stronger or more convincing evidence against them. These are valid points, and I do not deny that there are other suspects who have a good case to be considered as Jack the Ripper. In fact, in this series, we have looked at 13 other suspects, and we have seen that each of them had some reasons to be suspected and some reasons to be doubted. We have seen that each of them had some supporters and some detractors, and that each of them had some advantages and some disadvantages as potential candidates for the Ripper. Let me briefly summarise and compare the 13 other suspects that we have investigated in this series, and show you why I think William Berry is a better choice than any of them. The 13 other suspects are Montague John Druitt, a barrister and a teacher who committed suicide shortly after the Ripper murders. He was suspected by the police chief Melville McNarton, who wrote a memorandum naming him as the Ripper. He was also suspected by the executioner, James Berry, who hanged William Berry. However, there is no evidence that Druitt had any connection to the crime scenes or the victims, and there is no clear motive for his crimes. He was also described as a doctor of about 40, while Druitt was a lawyer of 31. His suicide could have been caused by other reasons such as depression, family troubles, or financial difficulties. David Cohen, a Polish Jewish vagrant and a lunatic who lived in Whitechapel and was committed to an asylum shortly after the Ripper murders. He was suspected by some modern authors and researchers who claimed that he was the real identity of Aaron Kosminski, the suspect named by the police commissioner Charles Warren. He was also suspected by some modern authors and researchers who claimed that he was violent and incoherent and that he matched the physical description of the Ripper. However, there is no evidence that he had any connection to the crime scenes or the victims, and there is no clear motive for his crimes. He was also described as a low-class Polish Jew, while Cohen was a homeless and illiterate man. His identification with Kosminski is speculative, as there is no proof that they were the same person. Karl Feigenbaum, a German sailor and a murderer who was executed in New York in 1896 for the murder of a woman. He was suspected by his lawyer, William Lawton, who wrote a book naming him as the Ripper. He was also suspected by some modern authors and researchers who claimed that he had a history of mutilating women and that he had a tumour that caused him to kill. However, there is no evidence that he had any connection to the crime scenes or the victims, and there is no clear motive for his crimes. He was also described as a middle-aged man with a dark complexion and a dark moustache, while Feigenbaum was an elderly man with a fair complexion and a grey beard. His whereabouts during the Ripper murders are unknown, but he was not in London for all of them. Joseph Barnett, a fishmonger and a lover of Mary Kelly, the last and the most mutilated of the Ripper victims. He was suspected by some modern authors and researchers who claimed that he killed the other victims to scare Kelly into giving up prostitution, and that he killed Kelly when she refused. He was also suspected by some modern authors and researchers who claimed that he had access to Kelly's room and that he had a violent argument with her before her death. However, there is no evidence that he had any connection to the crime scenes or the victims, and there is no clear motive for his crimes. He was also described as a quiet and respectable man, while Barnett was a rough and uneducated man. His alibi for the night of Kelly's murder was confirmed by the police and the witnesses. Joseph Thatcher, a French serial killer and necrophile who was executed in 1898 for the murder of at least 11 people, mostly adolescent farm workers. He was suspected by some modern authors and researchers who claimed that he was the French Ripper or the Southeast Ripper, owing to comparisons to Jack the Ripper. He was also suspected by some modern authors and researchers who claimed that he had a scarred face and a rabbit fur hat that composed his trademark appearance. However, there is no evidence that he had any connection to the crime scenes or the victims, and there is no clear motive for his crimes. He was also described as a middle-aged man with a dark complexion and a dark moustache, while Thatcher was a young man with a fair complexion and a light beard. His method of killing was different, as he strangled and stabbed his victims, and sometimes SA'd and ate them. H. Holmes, an American serial killer and con artist who was executed in 1896 for the murder of at least 9 people, mostly young women, who stayed at his hotel in Chicago. He was suspected by some modern authors and researchers who claimed that he was Jack the Ripper or that he was otherwise involved in the murders. He was also suspected by some modern authors and researchers who claimed that he had a medical degree and a torture chamber where he experimented on his victims. However, there is no evidence that he had any connection to the crime scenes or the victims, and there is no clear motive for his crimes. He was also described as a well-dressed man with a foreign accent, while Holmes was a shabby man with an American accent. His method of killing was different, as he used poison, gas, fire and acid to dispose of his victims. Prince Albert Victor, the grandson of Queen Victoria and the second in line to the British throne. He died in 1892 from influenza at the age of 28. He was suspected by some modern authors and researchers who claimed that he was Jack the Ripper or that he was otherwise involved in the murders. He was also suspected by some modern authors and researchers who claimed that he had a secret marriage and a child with a prostitute, and that the murders were an attempt to cover up the scandal. However, there is no evidence that he had any connection to the crime scenes or the victims, and there is no clear motive for his crimes. He was also described as a respectable gentleman, while Albert Victor was a sickly and dissolute man. His alibi for the nights of the murders was confirmed by the royal records and the witnesses. Seweryn Klosowski, a Polish barber and a poisoner who lived in Whitechapel and was hanged in 1903 for the murder of 3 of his wives. He was suspected by some modern authors and researchers who claimed that he was the real identity of George Chapman, the suspect named by the police surgeon Thomas Bond. He was also suspected by some modern authors and researchers who claimed that he had surgical skills and a violent temper. However, there is no evidence that he had any connection to the crime scenes or the victims, and there is no clear motive for his crimes. He was also described as a fair-haired man with a light moustache, while Klosowski was a dark-haired man with a heavy moustache. His method of killing was different, as he used poison instead of a knife, and he killed his wives instead of strangers. Michael Ostrog, a Russian doctor and a criminal who lived in London and was arrested for various offences. He was suspected by the police chief Melville McNaughton, who wrote a memorandum naming him as the Ripper. He was also suspected by some modern authors and researchers who claimed that he had a history of violence and insanity. However, there is no evidence that he had any connection to the crime scenes or the victims, and there is no clear motive for his crimes. He was also described as a middle-aged man with a dark complexion and a dark moustache, while Ostrog was an elderly man with a fair complexion and a grey beard. His whereabouts during the Ripper murders are unknown, but he was not in custody or in an asylum. Francis Tumblety, an American quack, doctor, and a charlatan who was arrested in London for indecency and fled to the US shortly after the Ripper murders. He was suspected by the police inspector, John Littlechild, who wrote a letter naming him as the Ripper. He was also suspected by some modern authors and researchers who claimed that he had a collection of uteri and a hatred of women. However, there is no evidence that he had any connection to the crime scenes or the victims, and there is no clear motive for his crimes. He was also described as a tall, thin man with a long black moustache, while Tumblety was a stout man with a grey beard. His flight to the US could have been caused by other reasons, such as avoiding prosecution for his fraud and his homosexuality. James Maybrick, a Liverpool cotton merchant and an arsenic addict who died in 1889 from arsenic poisoning, allegedly administered by his wife. He was suspected by some modern authors and researchers who claimed that he wrote a diary confessing to be the Ripper. He was also suspected by some modern authors and researchers who claimed that he owned a watch engraved with the initials of the victims and the name Jack the Ripper. However, there is no evidence that he had any connection to the crime scenes or the victims, and there is no clear motive for his crimes. He was also described as a respectable gentleman, while Maybrick was a sickly and addicted man. His diary and his watch are widely considered to be forgeries, as they contain anachronisms, errors, and inconsistencies. Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jewish barber and a lunatic who lived in Whitechapel and was committed to an asylum shortly after the Ripper murders. He was suspected by the police commissioner, Charles Warren, who wrote a report naming him as the Ripper. He was also suspected by some modern authors and researchers who claimed that he was identified by a witness and that his DNA matched a shawl found near one of the victims. However, there is no evidence that he had any connection to the crime scenes or the victims, and there is no clear motive for his crimes. He was also described as a low-class Polish Jew, while Kosminski was a middle-class Polish Jew. His identification by a witness is doubtful, as the witness refused to testify, and the police did not arrest him. His DNA match is also dubious, as the shawl is of uncertain origin and the testing is of questionable validity. William Berry, a warehouseman and a wife killer who was hanged in Dundee, Scotland in 1889 for the murder of his wife, Ellen Berry. He was suspected by the executioner, James Berry, and by some of the police officers who arrested him of being Jack the Ripper. He was also suspected by some modern authors and researchers who claimed that he had a connection to the crime scenes and the victims, and that he had a similar modus operandi to the Ripper. However, there is no conclusive evidence that he was Jack the Ripper, and there are some problems and objections that could be raised against him. He was also described as a middle-aged man with a fair complexion and a fair moustache, while Berry was a young man with a dark complexion and a dark beard. His method of killing was similar, but not identical to the Ripper, as he strangled and stabbed his wife and mutilated her genitals and organs. Mary Piercy, a housekeeper and a lover of a married man, who was hanged in 1890 for the murder of his wife and child. She was suspected by some modern authors and researchers who claimed that she was Jack the Ripper or that she was otherwise involved in the murders. She was also suspected by some modern authors and researchers who claimed that she had a hatred of women and that she had a knife similar to the one used by the Ripper. However, there is no evidence that she had any connection to the crime scenes or the victims, and there is no clear motive for her crimes. She was also described as a well-dressed woman with a foreign accent, while Piercy was a shabby woman with a British accent. Her method of killing was different, as she used a carriage to transport and dump her victims, and she did not mutilate them. These are the 13 other suspects that we have investigated in this series, and we have seen that each of them had some reasons to be suspected and some reasons to be doubted. We have seen that each of them had some supporters and some detractors, and that each of them had some advantages and some disadvantages as potential candidates for the Ripper. But after comparing and contrasting them, I still think that William Berry is the best choice for Jack the Ripper. I think that he had the most connection, the most similarity, and the most confession to the Ripper murders. I think that he had the most plausible motive, the most consistent description, and the most credible suspicion to the Ripper murders. I think that he had the least problems, the least objections, and the least alternatives to the Ripper murders. Of course, this is just my opinion, and you may disagree with me. You may have your own suspect of choice, or you may think that the Ripper was never identified. You may have your own evidence and arguments, or you may think that the evidence and arguments are inconclusive. You may have your own theory and explanation, or you may think that the theory and explanation are impossible. But whatever you think, I hope you enjoyed this series, and I hope you learned something new and interesting about the Jack the Ripper mystery. I hope you found this series helpful and entertaining, and I hope you appreciated this series as much as I did. This is the end of The Ripper's Gambit, the podcast series that explores the mystery of Jack the Ripper, the infamous serial killer who terrorised London in 1888. I'm your host, and I want to thank you for listening to this series. If you like this series, please subscribe, comment, and share it with your friends. And if you want to hear more from me, stay tuned for the next episode, where I will reveal another mystery that will keep you on the edge of your seat. As we conclude this series, we are left with more questions than answers. The identity of Jack the Ripper may forever remain a mystery, a spectre haunting the annals of criminal history. Yet, our quest for the truth has led us down a path of discovery, shedding light on the lives touched by this chilling chapter of history. And so, we close the book on The Ripper's Gambit, who among 14 holds the truth. But remember, every ending is but the beginning of a new story. The world is full of mysteries waiting to be unravelled, truths waiting to be discovered. I appreciate you, and I can't wait to talk to you again in the next episode. Until then, stay curious and keep listening. So keep questioning, keep exploring, and most importantly, keep listening. Until then, take care.